recently, a good friend of mine invited me to go to a game store that had just opened to play some Commander. We got involved with a pod of people we didn't know, and we had that pre-game discussion. You know, the one that goes really well all of the time, especially with the help of a bracket or number system, am I right? One of these people we hadn't met before explained that they could play any power level. They've got all of it with them. Everything right up to a 9 or a 10. Now, I don't even think I actually brought 9s or 10s with me in any situation. Well, in the new bracket system, I guess that's a 4, not CDH. Either way, I just thought, sure, just play a reasonably high power level thing then, and I'll do the same. Turns out, and some of you might know this from this anecdote being told on the channel before, but the opponent wasn't bringing 8s or 9s or 10s, or the real fire they thought they were. They were bringing a slightly upgraded Tyranid Precon, but they thought that was really good because it beat all their friends regularly. I was playing my favorite deck, or one of my favorite decks, Abdul Adrian and Candlekeep Sage, and this deck I played on Shuffle Up and Play, and it's quite strong. I don't think it'll go toe-to-toe with competitive EDH or even the highest echelons of non-CDH decks, but it can go toe-to-toe with a lot. It's got a lot of really crazy and wild things it can do. I played it on Shuffle Up and Play, and I brought it specifically because A, it's a deck I wanted to showcase, but B, I knew I was playing with a CDH player and Joseph Johnson, so you gotta bring the heat. I basically stomped this player who told me the wrong, like, sort of, idea of what they could bring to the table, and I felt a little bit bad. The player was also a bit salty about it, but really that, in many ways, talks to the conversations that you try and have at a table. But also the fact that actually, when I had a moment of doubt, I shouldn't have reached for the deck that I was itching to play. I should have instead reached for a deck that I would have wanted to play, but was designed for these scenarios. A deck of the archetype I want to call Scaling. I own 2 of these decks. I own Captain Nagathrod. I'm never going to get that right. I actually play a Japanese extended border version that I opened from a Baldur's Gate booster with a Morphic Pool and another card that's in the deck, all in Japanese. It's like the universe was telling me to build him. But yeah, I can't pronounce his name normally, so why play it in English? And I've also got Koram the Undertaker. Both of these decks do a lot of similar stuff, but in very different ways. Firstly, they're both mill decks. They mill in different ways. The Captain Nagathrod, it wants to utilize horrors to hit opponents and make them mill. At the beginning of their end step, you can put an artifact or creature from an opponent's graveyard into play that was milled this turn. Meanwhile, Koram does very minimal milling, just milling each player for 1 when he goes to combat, but he allows you to play 1 spell and 1 land from a graveyard, not just your own, but your opponent's do, per turn. So both of them mill, and both of them look to play your opponent's stuff. And this is why they're scaling. I'm going to go into more of this with some card choices and philosophy around this, because they can play with all the way down into the absolute lowest end of worse than a precon, right up into, God, the bracket's such a mess, your lower 4s, I guess. I don't think it truly scales with the entire like gauntlet of Commander, because this will not play into CDH or the upper power levels of non-CDH, simply because, well, the decks don't do too well into combo or synergy. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But ultimately, if you think that the table you're playing at hasn't had a very good conversation, you can crack one of these decks out if you were to build one, and through the utilization of theft and stealing other people's stuff and playing with it, you are playing on the same playing level and the same even keel and field as other people at the table. Now, there's a lot of caveats to this. There's pros and cons, there's positives and negatives. For example, what I'm going to put right here at the beginning of the video is that some casuals that you're trying to play a softer game with and play with their power level of stuff, those casuals or newer Commander players are going to piss themselves when you try and play with their cards. We'll unpack that notion after the sponsor spot. So let's get into it. Let's talk about scaling decks, or essentially theft or copying decks. Things that I think in Commander are very good at playing at lower to even the middling high end of Commander. A deck you can take with you to all sorts of tables, events, and game spaces and get good games with. If you want to buy any of the cards discussed in this video, coolstuffinc.com. Use the code Kenobi at checkout to get 5% off your order, and it helps support the show. I've got a Moxfield link down below to the entire Captain Nagathrod deck. I might even put Koram down there if I get time to write it up. You can get the whole deck from Cool Stuff Inc. for less than $200 if you were so inclined. The deck is not optimized, so don't expect it to be optimized. I'll explain more of that as the video goes on. And you can go to magicmadhouse.co.uk and use the code on screen right now to get 5% off your order when buying Magic cards, Warhammer, Pokemon, Lorcana, any of your nerdy needs. Go to magicmadhouse.co.uk. So, these decks are aiming to scale because they play with the cards of your opponents. So there's a lot of things we need to talk about here, a lot to unpack, if you will. Like I said, some players will get upset with you if you try and play with their toys. So recently at a store, I tried to play Captain Nagathrod, and when I explained that I'm going to mill and utilize other people's game pieces, one of the players, who was relatively new to Magic and Commander, got very angry and upset and said he would just step up from the table and walk away. I thought that was very strange, but I didn't want to push that, so I played something else instead. They then combo killed the table on turn 4 by accident, and then they were pretty happy for me to play Captain Nagathron after that. I think they just wanted to win with their combo before we got to the game where I stole all their stuff. Magic players and nerds are a difficult and interesting bunch, aren't they? But this is a real consideration you have to have, and something I would bring up with people, not only from the fact that some people don't want you to play with their toys, but there is a frustrating element for some people where they take your cards and play with them. I played with a patron, shout out to Belial, in a game at Command Fest London or Birmingham. It's one of the English ones recently. I played Captain Nagathron and I stole their guy's cradle. I think it was turn 2. No, turn 3. I played it early. No, it wasn't. It was Karam. What am I on about? I was playing Karam. I got an early Karam down, attacked, trigger, flip stuff, saw a guy's cradle, played their guy's cradle. It was also funny because I had my guy's cradle in hand, a card that I don't think should be in Karam. I'll come to that more about playing at a lower power level later. But playing someone else's guy cradle is very funny and interesting, but I knew Belial and Belial knew me, and I'm not going to steal their fucking guy's cradle. There are other people that are going to argue with suspicion or caution at the very least when you're going to play with their expensive bits of cardboard. So firstly, if you're going to play a deck that steals other people's stuff, try and play sleeves that are a color that most people do not play. You have to do a check after every game to make sure you don't even accidentally pick up someone else's card. It's just a reality of playing this kind of deck. Furthermore, to expand on the idea of scaling, the idea is that we are going to steal other people's creatures and artifacts or lands and just general spells when it comes to Karam. This allows you to scale with singular powerful cards or singular cards that do things on their own, engine cards. Taking someone's Smothering Tithe, for example, or taking someone's Powerhouse Haymaker creature makes sense. Stealing someone's Craterhoof Behemoth on its own is just a 6/6 haster with no other creatures in play, right? There are elements and certain cards that just don't really work because they require a setup to get there. These decks only really scale if you're playing into decks that tend to play just big Haymaker creatures and spells and things like that, which tends to be the lower power level of EDH and Commander. There's also an element that stealing some sort of squirrel payoff when you have no squirrels doesn't do a whole lot either. So again, the decks that are the general power level of the cards are lower, but they synergize stronger. Those decks are also going to give you a weaker time playing this deck as well. However, that brings me to this interesting point around puzzles and how it's very, very fun if you want a new creative challenge to try and solve the board state and the puzzle of Commander with other people's stuff. So what I mean with that is that you may play removal and answers yourself. You should play some forms of interaction. I've got some in the captain deck that we'll talk about in a moment. But sometimes it's really fun to see a problem permanent or problem board state, and through your milling, theft, graveyard digging, you find things from other people's decks to solve the problem in play. It's a thing I love about Magic. I really like unoptimized decks, piles of random shite and cards. That's why I love Party Box so much, where you have to find a solution in the chaos. I find that much more interesting and much more of a test of my fundamental skills in Magic than can I goldfish the same strategy over and over and over. There also comes this collaborative element sometimes where a board needs to be dealt with and players don't have the answers in hand or on board, and then you start to mill people and you have conversations with them about who should I hit with this mill spell or this theft spell, like bribery. What do you have in your deck? What can we use to fix the situation? You'll be surprised that even some players that think they don't like theft decks, as it were, will find that interaction, that conversation at the table actually really interesting and fulfilling once you get into the weeds of the match. And it can be really funny and like memorable and like a story that you tell afterwards and other players will tell when you find the win through other people's pile of synergistic cards. So to go back to that squirrel reference that I made earlier, or even the Craterhoof, I guess, that's easier to find really the solution, right? Play a lot of stuff, then steal the Craterhoof. But with the squirrel example, if you steal multiple squirrel payoffs and build your own squirrel board and play more squirrels in the squirrel deck, some players are going to be tilted by that, but other players will find that very, very funny. I've had players be like tilted, but in a funny and like sort of like self-referential way where they're like, I'm having a bad game. You've played more squirrels than I have. And that's one of the important parts about Commander, right? It's not always about winning. It's about the stories that you tell and the fun you have along the way. And these kind of piles of cards do that via this weird find your way in the dark being your opponent's graveyards. With all that said, there's an important note to make about Captain Nagaroth himself. I spoke about a build of this, or my early build of this, in a previous video about not optimizing the ever-loving shit out of your decks. In that video, I talked about how I was playing a copy copy of Rise from the Grave because it was just there when I was building the deck. I love this idea of building decks around the cards that I just have available, that I have on hand. I don't really enjoy buying huge swaths of cards online to then build a deck from them because A, the options are infinite when you're buying online and building with not the cards that you have in front of you, and thus it can be overwhelming, perhaps even decision paralysis sets in. But I also like the restriction, again, the problem solving, just using the stuff you've got. However, when the general gist of the deck itself is to steal stuff and find its way in the dark, like I said, playing inefficient ways to steal those things or inefficient ways to interact with people is giving yourself too many hoops to jump through. We are looking for a deck that, like I said, scales from 1 to mid 4, and thus it plays at all different power levels. If you start to make the cards you're playing with worse than they could be, not the best in class, for example, or even not even the middling in class in the case of Rise from the Grave, you end up having situations where you are playing bad cards to get bad cards, and you're not having a very fun time. If you've got to jump through hoops to put things into people's bins, you shouldn't have to jump through hoops to get things out of people's bins as well. For that reason, there are better versions of Rise from the Grave that you can play. A copy that I've got in this deck, for example, is 5 mana from the Catacombs. Put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with a corpse counter on it. You take the initiative. If that creature leaves the battlefield, exile instead of putting it anywhere. In a sense, it has a finality counter on it, but it's a finality counter that will even work when you flicker it. But most importantly, you take the initiative, which is quite a bit of upside, and it has an escape cost as well, 5 cards and 5 mana to play this again from the graveyard, which is pretty good in this circumstance because some of your cards will self-mill as well, or mill everyone, so you can hit this or enable this. And on the flip side of that, if we're not looking for 5 mana that gets you a load of extra value in modes, you can go for the good old classics. Animate Dead is 2 mana, and it can take things from your bin or any bin, and it will be a cheap way to put other people's stuff into play. So if you mill, kill, or an opponent discards something into the bin and you Animate Dead it, you get a 7-drop, for example, you're paying far less than the opponent is doing. And you could see that as being horribly efficient when trying to play with lower power level tables, right? But again, remember, you gotta get that thing into the bin out of someone else's deck through mill, discard, or killing anyway. So again, I don't think you should begrudge yourself from playing the efficient way to get the thing into play if you're jumping through hoops to get it into the zone you're going to steal it from later. And on that topic, I want to talk about my Karam deck that I haven't got written up yet. Like I said, it might show up in the description below if people want to see it. But Karam, again, is Jund Mill. So one of the backup plans, which is an important point too. You want a backup plan here. You can't always just be playing other people's shit, because sometimes playing other people's like Angel out of their Angel deck isn't going to get the game to be over soon. So having backup plans, not necessarily a combo, but some sort of backup plan is good. In the case of both Captain and Karam, I'm trying to mill people out. And in Karam's case, he's an interesting commander because he's Jund Mill. There's no blue involved. Having 2 mill decks in Commander where mill is already very bad, and one of them is Jund, is so fun. It's so fun to actually get someone with the mill, and when it happens, it's pretty memorable. Again, telling a good story. For those of you interested, one of the big backup plans is to play Altar of the Brood in my Karam deck and put a lot of stuff into play. A backup lands package alongside Scoot Swarm and Field of the Dead. So I can just make a lot of tokens that can just win the game on their own, but preferably I'm trying to trigger Altar of the Brood, make loads of tokens, and mill everyone out, both enabling me to steal their stuff with Karam himself, but also actually deck people via the mill plan. One of the secretly best cards in the deck for multiple reasons is Gravebreaker Lamia, a 5 mana 4/4 enchantment snake. Lamia? Why is Lamia a creature type? That's so strange. Anyway, it's a snake Lamia. I don't even know what the fuck a Lamia is. It's got lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast this from the graveyard. Importantly, Karam says during each of your turns you may play a land and cast a spell from among cards in graveyards that were put there from libraries this turn. So the fact that Gravebreaker Lamia allows you to shoot something directly into the bin allows you to cast that card whilst Karam is in play. So the obvious pick, you might have just heard me close my deck box there. I had to read Karam verbatim instead of getting up on screen. Oh, it feels so analog and non-digital. But the obvious get for Gravebreaker Lamia is Altar of the Brood. This is one of the 1-2 punch of a combo that doesn't just end the game and thus feel bad for players you're playing in the 1, 2, or 3 bracket, but instead is a combo that allows me to start doing more milling, which is, let's be honest, not the easiest thing to do in Commander anyway. And positively, Gravebreaker Lamia does fit into all brackets as one of the few tutors in the deck. But to go back to a point I was making about playing the best stuff or the worst stuff or, jumping through hoops, One of the problems I found with Karam is that whilst I've got a backup plan and I am primarily playing with other people's stuff, which is very fun, I am playing some incredibly powerful cards that do raise eyebrows at a table. Namely, because of the lands package around Random Excavator and Scoop Mob, I have Mox Diamond in the deck. And I mentioned earlier, Gaia's Cradle's in there too. I own one, I make a lot of tokens, I make a lot of mana thus, and I can play other people's big stuff. Normally I'm using the mana to cast other people's things, but both of these cards do make you look like the threat, which is bad from a strategy perspective, but it also really fucks up the power scaling element of Karam. If I play a Gaia's Cradle at a table of ones, if we're using the bracket system still, I'm evidently no longer a one, because Gaia's Cradle is on the game. Is it on the game changer list? Yeah, of course it is. Yes, it is. So I'm playing fast mana or explosive big mana from lands for very easy. I personally think I'm going to take both Gaia's Cradle and Mox Diamond out of Karam. Like I said, the decks win cons do scale, but these cards do make it get there a lot quicker, and thus make it probably too good compared to lower powered decks. And it fails in the role and the aim that I'm going towards with Karam. Before we get into the full details of some of the cards from Captain Nagathrod, here's some other commanders that fit this archetypal concept, if you will. You want to nick people's stuff, right? So some commanders will ask you to do that and have you have a payoff, like Don Andre, the Renegade Pirate, who gives you buffs to your creatures you don't control and gives you treasures when you play cards you don't own. It doesn't actually steal itself, and one of the problems I have with these decks is that playing theft effects as spells isn't quite as good as having them literally in the command zone like Karam or Captain Nagathrod. Send Triplets is probably one of the most famous theft decks to have ever existed. At the beginning of upkeep, you pick a player and you get to cast spells from their hand. This card used to be one of the boogeymen in the format, or boogie ladies, shall we say, and it still kind of is. People do not like playing against this card. People will see it and groan when it enters the command zone. Just keep that in mind. Gonti Canning Acquisitor is one of the more recent additions to this archetypal sort of strategy. Spells you cast that you don't own cost one less, and when creatures hit people, you get to get a mini Gonti effect, where you exile the top card of their library and you can cast it and use mana of any ability it costs to cast it in future. I actually really like Gonti and I considered building him, but Karam took all that jazz away, or Karam came first, I believe, but Karam sort of took up all that energy, if you will. Admiral Beckett Brass is another pirate payoff, but she does the stealing herself. Quite famous. People are aware of her as an entity, but I don't think people are scared of her or get upset by her. Xanathar, the Guild Kingpin, is a send triplet that hits the top of the library, and thus feels far less oppressive because you're not taking cards out of their hand. And also, it's got this fun thing where milling them and manipulating the top of their library is part of the fun. Xanathar Guild Kingpin is in my Captain Nagathrod deck. And then you've got your Marik Rebereats that steal things and then eventually kill them when you untap her. And you've got Brian Stoutharm, where stealing things and then throwing them at people is also fun. There's quite a few of these commanders floating around, and I think they're very fun build-arounds. As far as Captain Nagathrod himself, let's talk about some of the stuff that's in here. There's a lot of horrors. Aboleth Spawn is a flash 2/3 horror with Ward 2. This card is very pushed. And it says, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control causes the triggered ability of that creature to trigger, you may copy that ability. You may choose new targets of that copy. So basically, this is a horror that plays into Captain Nagathrod, but it also copies and borrows or steals, but lets them still have their version, triggers of creatures entering the battlefield under other people's control, which is a very unique and fun way to get huge amounts of value and play with other people's stuff. You get weird political elements where you're asking people to cast things or trigger things, and it's very fun. Clones are a good way of doing the whole theft thing, and there are many different versions of them, from your your phantasmal images to your stunt doubles. Some of them are more fancy than others, though. Autotron Soldier being a 6-mana artifact alien soldier that when it enters the battlefield is a copy of a creature on the battlefield, except that creature is not legendary, and then it has Myriad. So when you get a combat attack with it, you get to make more copies of it attacking each player, and thus you get to have multiple copies of people's commanders without stealing them. And that's an interesting point about this kind of deck as well. I would recommend not literally stealing people's commanders. Cards like Bribery are very strong, and they can be very toolboxy, and they're just a lot of fun to resolve too. Most players won't be too bitter about it, although you get to thumb through the whole deck. But importantly, Bribery often doesn't lead to you stealing their commander. I would avoid stealing commanders at first with lower powered or more casual newer players. That's going to piss some people off. You can steal commanders, just don't do it as your primary way of doing the whole playing with their toys. Fairy Artisans is another card that goes into a lot of these decks, not just Nagathrod. A 4-mana 2/2 with flying. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, create a token of a copy of that creature, except it's an artifact in addition to other types, and then exile all of the creatures that are currently copied with Fairy Artisan. And thus you get a copy of everything that enters the battlefield. You get the ETB triggers, you can stack them to sack effects. It's just a very good magic card generally, and I think it's good in EDH generally, but it's also fun in this I'm going to utilize the things that aren't my own to enact some sort of hobbled together game plan. Grimmer is an often overlooked card in this sort of like category. A 4-mana 1/4, it can't be blocked, and whenever Grimmer deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles a card from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery card, and you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then that player puts the exiled card that weren't cast this way on the bottom of the library in any order. The important point here is that you get to cast it for free, which is a huge boon when you're doing this kind of thing. There are some cards I'm going to mention in a moment that are fan favorites. They're my favorites from back in the day, but they're slow and they're kind of the whole thing I talked about of jumping through too many hoops. They're bad, but I play them in here because I love them and they fit the horror theme. Grimmer, on the other hand, is just a strong effect like this. Of course, if you hit counter spells, it's bad. If you hit a Wrath when you don't want a Wrath, it's also bad. So you have to make some considerations about who you're hitting and what you might get. But again, a bit of top deck manipulation, a bit of fate sealing or similar, and you can do some really cool stuff with this. Cards that are like classic versions of this stuff. We got Mind Leech Mass, a 8-mana 6/6 with trample. Does combat damage to your player, you may look at that player's hand. If you do, you may cast a spell from among those cards without paying its mana cost. An absolutely tremendous effect that is very fun to resolve, and it can upset people too. It's a bit of a partial send triplets, but it's horribly inefficient. I only play it in Captain Negathrob because the deck is a lower powered deck in theory, and the horror thing plays into it. And this is a card I loved as a kid and rarely ever got to hit people with. And then we have the absolute fucking haymaker card. Now, both of these, which is Command the Dreadhorde and Breach the Multiverse, both of these are like game ending in many ways. Breach allows you to make each player mill 10 cards, and for each player, yourself included, choose a creature card or planeswalker already in the graveyard and put those cards into play under your control. Very, very strong effect. You often get way more than the 7 mana you cast on it, but of course it is 7 mana, and thus it should be considered a game-winning or a game-dominating spell. Don't feel bad about playing haymakers like this, especially when in reality they can whiff if you hit like a Llanowar Elves, a Llanowar Elves, a Llanowar Elves, and I don't know, a Llanowar Elves? What's worse than a Llanowar Elf? Like an Ornithopter or something. It'd be weird if you hit a Llanowar Elves in your own deck and you're not playing green. Meanwhile, Command the Dreadhorde is a similar situation. It's 6 mana, it costs you a load of life, but you get to put loads of stuff into play. You can assemble combos out of other people's yards. You can do crazy shit with this. But again, it's 6 mana, you're paying loads of life. No one can begrudge you having a 6 mana haymaker if opponents aren't interacting or stopping you from casting it. The last card I'm going to mention for this category of deck that I don't actually currently have in Captain Negathrob, which I should find a copy of and put in, is Chromatic Lantern. Now, Chromatic Lantern's better in 3-color decks, of course. Captain Negathrob is blue-black and thus doesn't really need it. But if you are stealing people's stuff and you need to make mana to either cast them off some older effects, bearing in mind that newer cards like the new Gonti don't care about the color of mana that you are using to cast them. Hell, neither does old Gonti, I think. But if you're putting people's creatures into play, or you're putting people's artifacts into play, and you might need to activate their activated costs, which might cost red mana or green mana, it's good to have access to those things via Chromatic Lantern. So weirdly, even the 2-color play of people's stuff decks, Chromatic Lantern's actually really good at enabling those kind of things. The reason I made this video is that this, in practice, has been a really fun experiment. I've always enjoyed playing other people's stuff in Commander, but playing Captain Negathrob and playing Karam have been better than I thought they'd be. In terms of like stories and fun, I have had huge amounts of fun. People have laughed along with me. They've been very good at scaling into those lower powered games and playing on an even field with people. I just really enjoyed them. And it made me want to talk about that, not only the decks themselves, which like I said are unoptimized. I don't really optimize my decks very much if I am playing Gaia's Cradle, Mox Diamond and Karam, but even unoptimized versions of these have led to incredibly fun games, and thus I hope this helps other people to build something similar and play something similar and play varied and interesting games where you get to piece together a puzzle out of other people's mess, like some sort of trash panda, like a raccoon. I've been Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi on the internet. Let me know down below if there's a scaling or theft commander that you think I should have mentioned in this video or should be talked about in the future. Is there one that wasn't in the top ones that I spoke about earlier? Let me know in the comment section below. I've been Vince. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the sponsor links down below. Subscribe to the channel. If you want to support the channel, Patreon is the best way to do so. There's a link down there too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.